They said the mountain man lived alone because he liked it that way, that he buried his past somewhere deep in the snow. So, when he sent for a mail-order bride, folks whispered who would be desperate enough to come. But when the stagecoach arrived, it wasn't the Missouri widow he expected. It was a young Chinese woman who didn't speak a word of English and had nowhere else to go. Why was she sent? Why did he take her in? And what kind of love, if any, could grow in the silence between two souls carrying so much pain? When a silent woman stepped off that coach and into a stranger's life, the mountains held their breath. What was meant to be a transaction became something far more sacred. And in a town full of eyes, only two hearts truly saw each other. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories aren't just about the past, they're about us now. If you believe in dignity, redemption, and quiet strength, then you belong here. Let me know which state you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that matter. The snow came early that year, creeping down from the peaks like a white shawl laid across the shoulders of the Bitterroot Mountains. It dusted the pines, softened the ridges, and muffled the silence already wrapped around the narrow valley where Elias Boone had built his cabin, plank by plank, after the world turned its back on him, or maybe he turned his back on the world. The smoke from his chimney curled lazily into the cold air as he split firewood with a rhythm that matched the thudding ache behind his ribs. His beard had grown long and gray, his hands were thick with calluses, and his voice had gone unused for weeks at a time. But somewhere inside that quiet fortress of wood and solitude, a letter lay folded and refolded so many times it had worn soft at the creases. He'd sent it 6 months back, scratched out in his best attempt at neat penmanship, the words clumsy but honest. He had requested a companion, not for love, he'd insisted, but for company, for decency, for a second voice in a house that had echoed too long with nothing but wind. The agency had written back in neat, impersonal script. A widow from Missouri had agreed. She was 31, educated, practical. She would arrive before the first hard freeze. He had read that letter every evening like a sermon, then folded it back and placed it beneath the oil lamp beside his cot. By late November, he had cleared the spare room and patched the leaky roof. He built new shutters for the windows, lined the shelves with dry goods, and even cleaned the mirror, though he couldn't stand to look in it. He remembered how his wife used to hum as she chopped vegetables, how his daughter used to braid scraps of fabric into little dolls. The house was too quiet now, always had been. That's why he sent the letter. That's why he waited. The stagecoach came in on a Wednesday, wheels groaning under the weight of snow and travel. Elias stood at the edge of the dusty depot in Elk's Crossing, his thick coat drawn tight against the cold, his hat low over his brow. Townsfolk gave him wide berth. They always had. The Boone man, quiet, strange, maybe dangerous. That's what folks muttered. When the door of the coach opened, Elias stepped forward. But the woman who descended wasn't who he expected. She was young, far too young to be the Missouri widow, and small, wrapped in a too thin coat that didn't belong to her. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she clutched a sack to her chest like it held everything she owned. Her hair was jet black and coiled neatly, her boots mismatched. She stepped onto the snowy ground and looked around, confused, shivering. The driver climbed down, hat in hand. "This one was put on in Sacramento," he said gruffly. "Didn't speak a lick. Folks thought she was yours." Elias frowned. "She ain't." But the woman was looking up at him, her lips parted in a silent breath, her expression unreadable. She didn't understand the words, that much was plain, but she understood she'd been handed over, and no one else was stepping forward. The station master emerged, glancing over the ledgers. "No name," he said. "Paper just said Boone. Mix up, I reckon. Maybe the agency bungled the address." "Where's the widow?" Elias asked. No one had an answer. The coach had to keep moving. The driver shrugged, the station master sighed, and the townsfolk stared. The girl didn't move. Elias looked at her, at the threadbare sack, the shoes, the way her shoulders trembled, and something ancient stirred in him. Not pity, not yet, but memory, perhaps, of another girl who once needed someone to choose not to walk away. He let out a long breath, ran a hand over his beard, and nodded once. "Come on," he muttered, Ain't safe to be standing out here. I have his carting too. It was lever. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She stepped toward him, uncertain, and he turned back toward the path that led into the trees, toward the cabin that waited, silent, like the mountain man himself. The ride back to the cabin was quiet but not peaceful. Snow whispered through the tall trees, and the wagon creaked with each jostle along the frozen path. Elias Boone held the reins with practiced hands, but his jaw was tight. The girl, no. The woman sat beside him, eyes cast down, fingers clutched in her lap like she might dissolve into the cold if she let go. She hadn't spoken a word, not even when he'd offered her the extra wool blanket or when he'd pointed toward the road that led north, the only direction out of the valley. She had simply nodded, once, and climbed onto the wagon like a ghost with nowhere else to haunt. In town, folks had watched the whole thing with their usual mix of fear and curiosity. The Boone man bringing a strange girl up the mountain, no English, no papers, no name but what the driver scrawled from memory. Elias could feel their eyes even after he'd turned his back on them. He heard their thoughts in the wind, sharp and unkind like how the mountain eats a man's sense and spits out something else. He hadn't bothered to answer. He didn't have it in him to explain what even he didn't understand. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was slipping behind the ridge. The air had that purple hush to it, the kind that came just before the first deep freeze. Elias climbed down and opened the door. The cabin creaked like it was surprised to see two people instead of one. Inside, the fire had gone to embers, and the air held the chill of absence. He struck a match and lit the lamp. Its glow painted the walls in gold and shadow. She stood in the doorway, uncertain. Snow melted off her boots and puddled on the threshold. "You coming in?" he asked, gruff. She didn't answer, only stepped forward, silent as snowfall. He pointed to the bench by the fire. She sat without being told twice. He ladled stew from the pot and handed her a bowl. She took it with both hands and gave a shallow bow of her head. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't eat until he sat down opposite her, his own bowl in hand. "You got a name?" he asked after a while. She looked up, eyes wide, then reached into her bundle. From it, she pulled a scrap of paper, edges worn soft and torn at the corner. She handed it to him with both hands, her face unreadable. He unfolded it. In delicate script, almost calligraphy, were two words, Mei Lin. He studied the name, then her. Mei Lin, he repeated, slow and steady. She nodded, her eyes searching his for something approval, perhaps, or safety. He gave neither. Instead, he stood in motion toward the side room, the one he'd cleaned and warmed in hopes of someone else. "That's yours. You sleep there." She rose, holding her bowl close like it was a tether to something real. She stepped into the room without a word. Elias sat alone by the fire, bowl in his lap, untouched. He looked down at the name still held in his thick fingers. Mei Lin. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like old bones. Inside, the silence deepened, not empty, but full of questions. Neither of them had the words to ask. In town, they would speak of her arrival with suspicion, a foreign girl with no voice, brought into the woods by a man they already feared. But they didn't know the cabin or the grief it held. They didn't know the man who still lit a second lamp each night, out of habit, for someone long gone. And they didn't know the woman who bowed before a bowl of stew, as though even that was more kindness than she'd ever known. The days that followed her arrival passed like slow-moving shadows, stretched long by silence and softened only by the rhythm of routine. Elias Boone rose before dawn, as he always had, stoked the fire, boiled water for coffee, and walked out into the woods with his rifle slung over one shoulder. He said nothing when he passed her door. He didn't have to. She was always awake, always sitting cross-legged on the thin mattress by the window, watching the snow drift past the glass like she was waiting for something to appear in it, or disappear. He didn't know what to make of her. She was too quiet, too still. She didn't speak, didn't wander, didn't ask for anything, and that unsettled him more than if she had. A woman was supposed to talk, wasn't she? Complain about the cold, ask after the stove, comment on the food, something. But this one moved through the house like a shadow stitched to the corners, always present, never imposing. By the third morning, he found the floor swept clean and the kindling stacked in tidy rows near the hearth. He hadn't asked her to do it. He hadn't expected it either. When he opened his mouth to say something, maybe a thanks or a caution against wasting energy, he found the words caught like ice in his throat. Instead, he grunted and retreated to the workshop. The workshop was his haven, a lean-to built against the side of the cabin where he carved tools and mended traps. It smelled of pine shavings and oil. In there, he didn't have to watch her drift across the cabin like a ghost made of silk and silence. In there, he didn't have to feel the heavy stillness that now lingered in every corner of his home. He buried himself in the shaping of a new snare trigger, letting the sound of his whittling fill the void she left behind. Mei Lin, meanwhile, found a kind of rhythm in the quiet. Though the language eluded her, the cadence of the place did not. She swept, not because she was told, but because the dust reminded her of places she wanted to forget. She boiled water and steeped wild tea from herbs she found near the cabin. She folded her garments with care, stitched a torn hem with thread she salvaged from an old coat. It was not home, but it was something softer than what had come before. One afternoon, as the wind howled like a wounded thing through the trees, she found a small bird shivering on the windowsill, its wing bent at a terrible angle. It should have flown, should have left with the last of the warmth, but it hadn't, and neither had she. She gathered it gently in her hands and placed it in a box lined with spare cloth. She fed it crumbs and kept it near the fire. She sang to it, low and breathless, a melody without words. The bird chirped in response, weak but alive. That night, Elias paused in the doorway to the main room, candle in hand. She sat by the hearth, sewing by flickering light. The bird nestled in a cloth beside her. Her fingers moved with calm precision, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her longer than he meant to, not with suspicion, not even confusion, just wonder. He didn't speak. He didn't step closer. He turned away, back to the dark. Outside, the snow deepened, and inside the cabin, so did the silence, but it was no longer empty. It was shared, not yet understanding, not yet trust, but something like the first faint trace of warmth beneath the frost. The blizzard swept in without warning, tumbling from the northern peaks like a fury unloosed. 1 hour, the air had been still and brittle. The next, it howled through the trees, snapping branches and burying trails under sudden, savage drifts. Elias Boone had seen storms like this before. The mountains didn't announce their anger, they simply turned. So, when the cabin windows began to groan beneath the wind, he bolted the shutters and stoked the fire, then reached for the water pail to draw from the barrel outside. That's when he saw it, 2 small indentations in the snow leading around the side of the house. His gut tightened. He stepped into the storm, coat flung over his shoulders, boots crunching through snow, already knee-deep. The wind bit at his eyes, tore at his beard, but he followed the prints around the corner and found her there, crumpled in the snow, knees folded beneath her, one hand reaching toward the barrel, the other curled beneath her, like she'd tried to catch herself. Her hair had come loose from its knot, strands frozen against her cheek. Her lips were pale, her breath a weak cloud. "Fool girl," Elias muttered, though there was no anger in it, only fear. He bent and scooped her up, her body shockingly light in his arms. She didn't stir. He kicked the door open with his boot and brought her inside, laying her down near the hearth. He wrapped her in the fur blanket from his own cot, then placed another atop her. She murmured something in a language he couldn't grasp, a thread of sound thinner than the wind outside. The little bird chirped once from its box beside the fire, restless at the sudden motion. "Stay down," he said softly, as though speaking to both of them. He added another log to the fire and leaned close, checking the frost on her lashes, the slow movement of her chest. She wasn't unconscious, but she was too far into the cold. He worked slowly, boiled water, held it in cloth to her hands, rubbed warmth back into her fingers. His own knuckles ached with the old memories, with the echo of another body gone cold in his arms. A smaller one, a weight once carried through snow far deeper than this, toward a town too far to reach in time. He didn't speak of that. He never did. But that night, after she was sleeping again, and the fire danced golden shadows across the ceiling. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat in the chair by the flames. The bird dozed in its box. Mei Lin lay breathing evenly under the weight of the furs, a lock of her hair fallen across her cheek. "I had a daughter once," he said aloud to the fire. His voice was gravel softened by grief. "Emma, just 4 years old. Got sick in the winter. Fever took her fast, faster than I could get her out. Her ma blamed me. Maybe she was right." He stared into the flame, eyes unblinking. "After she left, I came here. Figured there was no more use for a man like me in a world that could lose something so small and good." Behind him, Mei Lin stirred but did not rise. "I don't know why you were sent to me," he said, voice low. "You weren't what I asked for. But you don't deserve this cold. No one does." He didn't see her eyes open, just slightly, nor the way her hand curled tighter around the edge of the fur. She didn't understand his words, not fully, but his voice carried more than language. And grief, like snow, settles the same on all hearts. Outside, the storm howled and clawed at the roof. But inside, the fire burned steady. And for the first time in a long while, Elias Boone sat near another soul and let the past speak without shame. The snow came heavy and constant, blanketing the valley in a silence so deep it felt like time itself had gone still. The path to town disappeared beneath waist-high drifts, and the trees bowed under the weight of ice, creaking like old bones in the wind. For Elias Boone and Mei Lin, the outside world became nothing but a memory trapped behind frosted windows. The mountains had sealed them in together, two strangers who shared neither words nor pasts, yet breathed the same cabin air, warmed their hands by the same fire, and moved through the same narrow space without touching. The quiet that once unnerved Elias began to shift. It was no longer the emptiness he had grown used to, a hollow kind of silence that echoed with things unsaid and people gone. Now it was something else, softer, like the hush that settles over a sleeping child, or the stillness in the moment before the first snowfall. He didn't know what to call it, and so he didn't try. But each time he saw her stoop to feed the bird, or catch his eye with a nod before setting a pot to boil, he felt it settle deeper into the cracks of his solitude. One morning, while the fire still fought off the edge of frost creeping in from the corners of the cabin, Elias took the iron poker and drew a circle in the ash beside the hearth. Mei Lin, seated nearby with the bird nestled in her lap, tilted her head. He tapped the circle once with his finger. "Son," he said. She blinked, then reached for the poker. Slowly, carefully, she added wavy lines around the circle. "Tai Yang," she said, the syllables light and unfamiliar. Then she looked at him, hopeful. He nodded once. "Son," he repeated, more gently this time. "Tai Yang." From then on, ash became their paper. He drew a tree, 3 jagged lines for the trunk, spreading branches above. "Pine," he said. She drew a curving line that split and forked like a vein. She whispered, then added tiny fish darting beneath. "River." Elias stared at the drawing. "River," he repeated. "That's good." Over days, they built a shared language, not of grammar and rules, but of firelight and instinct. She pointed to the bird. "Meow." Then to herself. "Mei Lin." He tapped his chest. "Elias." And then, after a long moment, she took the poker again. With slow, deliberate strokes, she drew the shape of a house, its roof peaked, its door open. Then she drew flames curling from the windows, smoke trailing upward in crooked lines. She paused, then added a small figure in the corner alone, stick-thin, crouched. Elias said nothing for a long time. The only sound was the pop of sap in the fire. Finally, he reached out, took the poker, and drew a hill, then a grave marker atop it, then 2 figures beneath, one tall, one small. He didn't speak, didn't have to. Mei Lin looked at the drawing, then at him. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something deeper recognition. They didn't try to explain anything more. The words were unnecessary. The ash told the stories that their tongues could not, and the fire lit the spaces between them. That night, Elias placed another log on the fire before she could. She brewed tea and handed him the cup with both hands. He took it and gave her a slow nod. Two lost souls, neither whole nor healed, had begun to speak in a language that did not need sound. It was a language of hands and ash, of grief, shared without judgment, and of the small, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, the snow outside would thaw one day, and something would remain. The wind had quieted that morning, but the cold remained, settling in the bones of the cabin like it meant to stay. Elias had gone to chop firewood, his coat pulled tight and hat low, while Mei Lin moved through the rooms with broom in hand and quiet purpose. She swept gently, careful not to stir the bird resting in its box, and careful not to disturb the small things Elias kept arranged, just so his tools, his rifle, the books with pages yellowed and corners curled. It was not her place to move them, and she did not. But when she came to the hearth, brushing dust from beneath the stone lip, her broom caught on something hollow sounding and wooden. She crouched, brushing away more soot. A narrow seam in the floorboards revealed itself, faint but precise. Her fingers, small and steady, pried gently at the edge. The wood gave way, lifting to reveal a shallow compartment carved beneath the floor. Inside sat a wooden box, darker than the planks around it, worn smooth by time and use. Its lid bore no name, only a simple brass clasp, tarnished but intact. She lifted it carefully, holding it in both hands as though it might break or vanish. There was weight in it, not just physical, but emotional, thick and quiet and pressing. She turned as the door opened, and there stood Elias, snow on his shoulders, axe still in hand. His eyes landed on the box, and he stopped in the doorway. For a long moment, neither moved. He didn't yell, didn't speak, but his face changed just slightly, as if something inside him, long locked away, had been found out. He took one step forward, then another, until he was close enough to reach for it. She offered it to him, head bowed, hands trembling just a little. He took it, fingers tightening around the edges. Then, without a word, he turned and walked to the far corner of the room, where the old rocking chair sat by the window. He placed the box on his lap and rested his hands atop it. The wind stirred outside again, faint and distant, like a memory returned. That night, the fire burned low and steady. Mei Lin had retired early, the bird nestled beside her, but Elias remained awake. He sat before the hearth, the wooden box now open on the floor beside him. The room was dark save for the firelight, which flickered across his face, casting his expression into lines older than his years. From the box, he removed a pair of delicate wire spectacles, lenses cracked. He held them for a long time, thumb brushing the frame as though remembering the shape of the woman who once wore them. Next came a tiny rattle, carved from oak and faded with time. He turned it in his palm, and it made no sound. It had been broken long ago. Lastly, he lifted a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and sealed with wax. He opened it. "Read it," whispered its words aloud, voice cracking, though no one was meant to hear. It was a letter, unsent, addressed to a woman named Clara Boone, written in a hand that tried to be strong and failed. "I'm sorry I wasn't enough. I'm sorry I couldn't save her. I understand if you hate me. I hate me too." He stared into the flames after that, eyes unblinking. The letter remained on his knee. The box lay open beside him, its contents few but heavy. Behind the curtain of the side room, Mei Lin sat upright in the dark. She had not been asleep. She had heard nothing she could translate, yet understood everything she needed to. The box beneath the floorboards had not just been hidden, it had been buried. And now, uncovered, it bled memory and sorrow into the cabin like smoke. But smoke, in time, always clears. The thaw came slowly, reluctant and uneven. Icicles dripped in rhythm against the eaves, and the trail into town became passable again, though muddy and lined with slush. Elias had delayed the trip as long as he could, but the flour was near gone, and the lantern oil low. He left Mei Lin with kindling and stew, promising in his own quiet way to return by nightfall. She had nodded, lips pressed tight, standing in the doorway, with the bird cupped in her hands like a prayer. The ride into Elk's Crossing was uneventful at first. The town looked the same, leaning buildings, horses tied to railings, the dusty smell of old smoke and tired people. but there was a sharpness in the air, something unsaid that waited like a snake under a porch. Elias tied his mule and headed toward the general store. Coat pulled close. He wasn't one for talk, and folks usually let him be. But today, eyes followed him like shadows. Inside the store, he handed over his list to Alma the shopkeeper. She took it in silence, then cleared her throat. "She's been seen," Alma said, not looking at him. He didn't ask who. He didn't have to. "Girl with you, she came in last week. Stayed outside while you bartered for coffee." Silas McGraw saw her, recognized her. Enacted. Elias's hand tensed on the counter. "Recognized," he repeated, voice flat. "Says she's a fugitive. Some servant or indentured girl. Says she ran off from a house in Sacramento. Claims he's got the papers." "He don't," Elias said, too quick. Alma's face softened. "I believe you, but not all do. There's talk. You know how this town island." He did. He could feel it as he left the store, the way conversations quieted, the way glances sharpened. He passed two old ranch hands leaning on a rail, muttering behind cupped hands. "Foreigner," one said under his breath. "Ain't right." "Girl thief," said another. "Could be she stole something, snuck in the country, tricked the mountain man." Elias didn't stop walking, but his teeth clenched. At the saloon, he pushed through the bat-wing doors, the smell of whiskey and sweat thick inside. Silas McGraw sat at the poker table, boots up, gold watch chain glinting across his vest. He was the kind of man who spoke too loudly and smiled too wide, wealthy, polished, and rotting beneath it. "Well, if it ain't Boone," Silas drawled. "Come down from your perch to show off your new property." Elias didn't answer. He stepped closer. Silas leaned back. "You've got something that don't belong to you. She's a contract servant. Ran from my brother's estate last year. Pretty little thing, though I doubt she's clean. Girls like that never are." The room went still. "You best bring her in, Boone. There's laws about this sort of thing. Harboring, theft. Or maybe you just need reminding." Elias's fist slammed onto the poker table, rattling chips and silencing the snickers. "You come near her," he said, voice like gravel and thunder, "and I'll remind you what men used to do to slavers." For a moment, Silas said nothing. Then he laughed high and sharp. "Is that a threat?" "No," Elias growled. "It's a promise." He turned, stormed through the doors, and mounted his mule with hands tight on the reins. The ride home was hard and fast. The mountain didn't ask questions. It just took him back, heart pounding, jaw set, mind racing. Behind him, the town simmered in whispers. They would call her a foreigner, a runaway. They would try to make her into something small and shameful. But Elias had seen the way she cradled the bird, the way she bowed before tea, the way she listened, even when she did not understand. Let them talk. The mountain knew better, and so did he. The morning after Elias returned from town, he was quieter than usual, and that was saying something. He didn't speak over breakfast, didn't touch the tea Mei Lin placed at his elbow, didn't even grumble when the bird fluttered too close to the hearth. He simply sat there, eyes fixed on the embers, jaw tight as leather, the weight of some unspoken decision settling over his shoulders like another layer of snow. When the sun crested the trees, he stood, fetched her shawl, and held it out with both hands. Mei Lin hesitated, but took it. He pointed to the mule, saddled and waiting. She nodded once, tucked the bird into her satchel, and followed. The ride was slow but sure, winding down the frost-hardened trail toward the lower valley. Elias said little, just enough to keep the animal steady and alert. Mei Lin clung to the saddle horn, her eyes sweeping the hills as if measuring the risk of every shadow. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. They arrived just past noon at a small, moss-covered cottage nestled near the bend of a frozen creek. The house was crooked in a way that only came from long years of use and care. A pair of wind chimes tinkled softly from the eaves, and smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of dried lavender and burning cedar. Elias dismounted and knocked twice. The door opened before the second knock had finished echoing. Miss Ida stood there, tall and wiry, with silver hair tied back beneath a red kerchief, and sharp eyes that softened the moment they saw Mei Lin. "Well, it's about time," she said, brushing snow from her apron. You come in before the wind bites your bones. The warmth inside was immediate. The fire popped in a stone hearth, and bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling like upside-down bouquets. Mei Lin stood near the threshold, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Ida approached, slow and unthreatening, then gently took one of Mei Lin's hands in hers. "These are work hands," Ida said, examining the calluses, the small scars. "Not a lady's hands, not a thief's either. She's earned her keep somewhere." Elias nodded, then sat heavily on the bench near the fire. "I don't know how to help her." Ida turned back to Mei Lin and smiled. "But you brought her here. That's help enough." From a tall cabinet, Ida retrieved a worn leather book, its pages filled with symbols and careful script. "My husband was a missionary in Guangdong, long before he passed. Taught me a few words and left me this. Been waiting a long time to use it again." She brewed tea from jasmine and dried ginger, speaking gently as the water boiled. She flipped through the book, pointed at the symbols, and spoke in careful, broken Mandarin. "Injiao, Shenmei Mingzi." Mei Lin's eyes lit, startled. She pressed a hand to her chest. "Mei Lin." Ida smiled, her voice warming. "Wai shi yi da." The connection was immediate and fragile, like a candle flickering in wind. Mei Lin answered slowly, cautiously, but the relief in her posture was unmistakable. Elias watched from the bench, arms crossed, the lines around his eyes softening. "Can she stay?" he asked after a while. "She's not mine to keep," Ida replied, "but I can help her find her footing." The tea steamed between them, sweet and strong, and for the first time since arriving in the mountains, Mei Lin sipped from a cup poured with welcome. Words came haltingly, but each one bridged a distance she thought uncrossable. She was no longer alone in a world of silence. Not entirely. And Elias Boone, watching from the quiet edge of the room, felt something shift not in her, but in him. A memory of family, of shared tea, of healing that didn't need to be fast to be real. The afternoon sun slipped behind the ridge, casting long fingers of shadow across Miss Ida's cabin. Inside, the scent of herbs lingered in the rafters, mingling with the sharper tang of steeping tea. Mei Lin sat cross-legged on the woven rug, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on the steaming cup in front of her. Elias remained near the door, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, his face unreadable, though something in the set of his jaw had softened. Miss Ida sat between them, the worn Mandarin primer open in her lap, her finger tracing the page as she searched for the next word. It had taken hours to get here, words spoken slowly, then repeated, drawn out with gesture and broken translation. But now, Mei Lin was ready to speak. Her voice was soft, but steady. Each word landed like a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through the room. "Mei Lin," she began, and Ida translated quietly. "My name is Mei Lin. Jia, Zai, Hangzhou, from Hangzhou." Ida nodded, more to herself than anyone else, and murmured the words to Elias, who blinked but said nothing. "Fuqin, Jinsi Shangren." Her father was a silk merchant. Her eyes flicked toward Elias, then back to her tea. "Bixu Changhuan, Zhai." A debt had to be paid. It was slow going, but the story came like a river breaking through ice. Her family had prospered once bolts of silk traded from the banks of the Qiantang River to the port of Shanghai. Her father wore fine shoes and drank jasmine tea from porcelain cups, but a drought came, and with it, loss. His business faltered. The debt collectors did not. One night, two men arrived with quiet voices and dangerous hands. Her father signed a paper. Mei Lin, 16 years old, was sold to cover the family's losses. "Bei Daizu," she said, "taken away." Ida's voice trembled slightly as she relayed the words. Elias did not move. From there, Mei Lin had been smuggled aboard a ship, crammed into the dark belly of a hold with other girls. They were told they would serve in fine houses. The truth came in San Francisco, a brothel in Chinatown, run by a man who smiled too much and never blinked. Her voice faltered here, but she didn't stop. The nights blurred together. The girls cried in their own languages. None of them heard. Then came the fire. She didn't know if someone lit it on purpose or if it had been the careless swing of a lamp, but the flames spread fast, thick and choking. She escaped through a back window, barefoot and coughing, and ran until the smoke was behind her. She hid in alleyways, then climbed into the back of a freight car headed east. No one saw her, or if they did, they didn't stop her. She rode in silence across the mountains, fed on crumbs, clung to shadows. When the train stopped, she found a town dusty, foreign, terrifying. She didn't know the name. She didn't even know the country anymore. She wandered until someone pointed her to a coach and handed her a slip of paper with the name Boone written in heavy black ink. I thought, maybe. Safe, she said, haltingly. Maybe kind. Miss Ida blinked back the sheen in her eyes. Elias said nothing for a long time. His fingers tapped against his arm, slow and thoughtful. When he finally looked up, his eyes met Mei Lin's, not with pity, but with something older and deeper, recognition. The fire that took her past had forged something else in its wake, resilience, quiet dignity. She was no lost girl. She had survived every cruelty the world had offered, and still she bowed her head when handed tea. The silence that followed her story was full, not empty, not awkward, just full of truth, finally spoken aloud, the kind of truth that left room for something new to begin. The snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing stubborn blades of brown grass beneath the weight of winter's retreat. The creek, once silent under a shell of ice, now murmured faintly as water found its way back into the world. At the cabin, the rhythm of days had shifted too, not in great leaps, but in the subtle, unmistakable turns of a life slowly shared. Elias had always split wood alone. It was a task he trusted to no one, not even his younger self, for he had once split more than he needed too much to keep busy, to keep memory at bay. But this morning, when Mei Lin followed him outside and pointed at the hatchet with quiet interest, he hesitated only a moment. Then he handed it to her, handle first. She gripped it cautiously, small hands adjusting to the weight. He stepped behind her, not close enough to crowd, just near enough to guide. He pointed to the log, placed her feet with a nudge of his boot, and mimed the motion. Arms high, then swift, deliberate force. She tried. The blade thudded into the wood and stuck without splitting. Her mouth pressed into a frown, but she didn't step back. Again, Elias said gently. She did. Again and again. Sweat beaded at her brow despite the chill. At last, the log cracked down the middle with a sharp, satisfying snap. She looked up at him, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with triumph. He nodded once, just once, but it was enough to make her smile bloom. Later that afternoon, she brought out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. From it, she took a delicate reed flute, no longer than her forearm. Elias had seen it before, nestled beside her sewing kit, but she had never played it. Now, sitting on the porch steps, she lifted it to her lips and blew a soft, trembling note. The sound was high and thin, almost fragile but steady. Then came another note, and another, until a melody emerged. Simple, slow, carried like a prayer on the wind. It was a lullaby, that much was clear, though Elias didn't know the words. He didn't need to. When she finished, she looked over at him, uncertain. That a child's song? He asked. She nodded. For sleep. He nodded in return, thoughtful. It's good. That night, after supper, with the fire casting soft light across the walls, Mei Lin played again. The bird, now almost fully healed, chirped along from its perch on the windowsill. Elias sat in his chair, fingers laced over his stomach, listening. When she reached the end, she sang the final bars, her voice barely more than a whisper. And then hesitant, raspy Elias joined her. His voice was untrained, worn from years of silence, but it met hers with surprising steadiness. He didn't know the words, only the tune. Yet somehow it came to him, like a memory of warmth long buried under snow. The two voices rose together, one high and clear, the other low and rough, mingling in the small cabin like the joining of two rivers. When the last note faded, silence returned. But it was different now. Not empty, not grieving, just quiet, like the hush between heartbeats. Elias looked at Mei Lin. She looked back. Neither spoke. But from that night forward, the cabin no longer felt like a place to endure. It felt like a place being remade note by note, log by log, kindness by kindness. A place where the past had not been forgotten, but where something new might take root in its stead. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the trees, ancient and knowing, seemed to hum the lullaby back. The thaw had come far enough that wagon wheels could bite into mud again, and smoke from nearby chimneys curled higher into the air, not with survival's desperation, but with something closer to routine. The cabin stood steady against the slope of the mountain, pine-sheltered and quiet. Inside, Mei Lin was hanging herbs to dry above the hearth, humming the lullaby in soft notes, while the bird hopped along the windowsill, its wing now fully mended. Elias sat at the table, carving a new flute from a hollow branch, rough fingers working slowly but surely. The quiet was broken, not by weather, nor by wild animal, but by the sound of hooves. Elias looked up, his eyes narrowing. Not a deer, not a stray traveler. The sound was heavy with purpose. 3 riders. He stood, set the knife down, and stepped to the door. Mei Lin froze mid-hum. Her eyes flicked toward him, wide and uncertain. He nodded once, calm but alert. The men came into view at the edge of the clearing. At the front, perched tall and arrogant in the saddle, was Silas McGraw. Behind him rode 2 ranch hands, with rifles strapped across their backs, their faces hard with practiced cruelty. Elias stepped onto the porch, shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, not raised, but not hidden either. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Silas reined in his horse and tipped his hat with mock politeness. "Well now, Boone," he drawled, the words sliding from his mouth like oil on water. "You've got something that don't belong to you." Elias didn't blink. "You're on my land. Won't be for long if you're breaking federal law," Silas said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. He waved it like a flag. "Signed affidavit says that girl you've got in there was bought and paid for. Property of Charles McGraw, my dear departed brother. And when he passed, all holdings, human and otherwise, transferred to me." The words settled in the air like ash. "Property." Elias's voice was low, steady. "She ain't property." Silas smirked. "You saying she's a free woman? Because I've got a whole town full of folks who saw her with you. And when the law comes knocking, they'll be mighty curious about a man harboring a runaway foreigner." There is many pan to expected. Inside the cabin, Mei Lin watched from the shadow near the window, her breath held tight in her chest. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the posture, the threat, the men with rifles. Elias didn't move from the doorway. "You brought paper. I can bring fire." The 2 men behind Silas shifted in their saddles. They were used to intimidation. They weren't used to resolve. Silas sneered. "You think this ends with us riding away?" Elias's grip on the shotgun didn't change. "I think it ends how you decide." For a long moment, the clearing was silent, save for the snort of the horses and the wind rustling through the trees. Then Silas lowered the paper and backed his horse a step. "You'll regret this," he spat. "I'll be back, with the law, and when I do, no mountain's gonna keep you safe." He turned his horse and rode off, the others trailing behind, but slower now, less certain. Elias didn't watch them go. He waited until the hoofbeats faded into the woods, then stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. Mei Lin stood with her hands clasped, eyes questioning. He didn't say what had been said. He didn't need to. He simply crossed the room, took the broken-winged bird from the sill, and placed it gently into its cage. "They're coming," he said. Mei Lin's eyes didn't waver. Her voice was quiet but firm. "We stay." Elias looked at her, something shifting in his face, pride, perhaps, or awe, maybe both. And as the wind picked up again outside, rattling the windows like a distant warning, the fire inside the cabin burned brighter. It would take more than threats and paper to undo what had been built here. This home had been forged in silence, in grief, in shared songs and split wood, and now it would be defended. Miss Ida knew the roads better than most men in Elk's Crossing. She had traveled them in storms, through births and burials, with poultices in her satchel and prayers on her breath. So when word reached her cabin carried by Elias himself, grim and quiet, the air around him colder than the snow, she didn't ask questions. She packed her bag with care and saddled her mule before sunrise. her eyes sharp beneath her wool hat, her jaw clenched in the way of someone who had no patience left for injustice. The snow was thick, crusted from a thaw and freeze, and the trail to town was slow going. But Ida didn't stop. Not when her fingers went numb, not when the wind burned her cheeks raw. She had seen too much in her years, too many young girls used and discarded, too many men like Silas McGraw who wore law and land like armor while treating people like property. And she had seen enough of Mei Lin to know the truth when it stood quietly in front of her, asking for nothing but a place to exist. When she reached town, she didn't head for the saloon, where the loud voices drank and lied. She went to the church. Reverend Amos was clearing snow from the front steps when she arrived. His hands were red with cold, his collar askew. He straightened when he saw her, surprise flashing across his face. "Miss Ida," he greeted, stepping forward. "Is something—" "I need a word," she cut in, brushing snow from her coat. He led her inside, and there, beneath the wooden cross and the quiet hush of dust dancing in the stained light, she told him everything. Not just about Silas's threat, but about Mei Lin's eyes, her hands, the story etched into her silence. She told him about the fire in California, the hidden train ride, the name Boone handed to her like a lifeline. And she told him what Elias had done, not as some wild man taking in a girl, but as a broken man offering his roof to someone more broken still. Reverend Amos listened. At first, his face was unreadable. Then it cracked just slightly. His mouth pressed into a line not of judgment, but of grief. "She's not a problem," Ida finished. "She's a person, and she's here. And if we don't protect her, we're worse than the men who tried to own her." From the church, she went to the general store. Alma paused her counting when Ida stepped in, took one look at her face, and set down the ledger. "I heard Silas made trouble," Alma said quietly. Ida nodded. "That girl's not his property. She's not anyone's. You know Boone. He's strange, yes, but he's no liar. And I've seen the way she watches the fire, like she's waiting for it to leap at her again. No thief looks like that." Then, to the postmaster, a man who'd once lost his daughter to illness and now kept mostly to himself, she told him too. Every time, the story grew clearer. The town that had once whispered suspicion began to fall into a quieter hush, a hush of guilt, of listening. By dusk, word had spread, not in shouts or gossip, but in quiet nods and closed mouths when Silas's name came up at the saloon. The Reverend drafted a letter to the circuit judge. Alma gave a stack of supplies to Ida without charging her. The mail clerk, who rarely spoke, stood outside his post for nearly an hour, watching the road that led up the mountain with a thoughtful squint. The shift wasn't sudden. It wasn't a wave. It was a thaw, slow but certain, and in a town where silence once meant judgment, it began, just barely, to mean solidarity. The sky had turned iron gray by mid-morning, a dull sheet of cloud pressed low over the valley, heavy with unfallen snow. The wind stirred through the pines with a strange urgency, as if it knew what was coming. Down the trail came the sound of hooves measured, official, and unwelcome. Elias Boone stood on his porch, shotgun cradled in his arms, the fire behind his eyes burning steady but cold. He'd been expecting them. 3 riders emerged from the woods, coats buttoned to the throat, badges glinting on their chests. Silas McGraw rode at the front again, this time without smirk or swagger. His mouth was a tight line. Flanking him were 2 deputies, younger men with lawman hats pulled low and hands near their holsters. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. Silas raised the forged affidavit like a weapon. "This is your last chance, Boone," he called out, voice loud and sharp against the stillness. "You're harboring a fugitive under state law. You hand her over now, and we won't press charges." Elias didn't move from the porch. "You bring a real judge. You bring real papers. Until then, you're trespassing." One of the deputies shifted in his saddle. "We got orders," he said, eyes narrowing. "You've got threats," Elias replied, "same as the last time." Inside the cabin, Mei Lin stood by the window. She had seen them approach, heard the words. She knew this moment would come, and yet, fear did not own her. She turned to the birdcage resting on the table, reached inside, and cradled the small sparrow in her hands. Its wing, once twisted and limp, now fluttered strong against her palm. The front door creaked open. Elias turned slightly but didn't stop her. Mei Lin stepped forward, her shawl pulled tight, her gaze level. She walked past him down the porch steps and into the snow, calm as still water. The clearing fell silent. Even the deputies paused. She stopped between the two sides, lifted the bird high, and opened her hands. The sparrow hesitated for a breath, then took flight, its wings cutting through the gray air, rising toward the treetops, with a cry that pierced the hush like a bell. It circled once, then vanished into the pines. Behind drawn curtains and cracked shutters, the people of Elk's Crossing watched. Eyes peered from the preacher's study, from Alma's storefront, from the blacksmith's loft. Whispers passed through rooms like wind under doors. That girl, they thought. She set it free. Silas's voice came, brittle now. This don't change anything. Elias stepped down from the porch. No, but it says everything. The deputies looked to each other, unsure. Silas seethed, paper crumpling in his fist. I'll be back. With more than this. Elias nodded once. We'll be ready. The riders turned, horses stamping in the snow. As they vanished back down the trail, Mei Lin remained standing in the clearing, watching the place where the bird had disappeared. She did not speak, but her message was written in the sky. No cage, no ownership, not anymore. Behind her, Elias stood with one hand on the railing. For the first time in years, he felt something stir that was not grief or rage, but pride. The storm had gathered, but the mountain had spoken. The following morning dawned bitter and sharp, the sky bruised with winter clouds, and the air dry with anticipation. Word had spread faster than any posted notice. In a town like Elk's Crossing, news moved in whispers and glances, in the sudden quiet when a name was spoken. By midday, half the townsfolk knew what had happened at the Boone cabin, how the girl had faced down Silas McGraw with nothing but a bird and her silence, how Elias had not raised his voice, only stood his ground. It didn't take long before people started to wonder, quietly at first, if maybe there was more to the story than what Silas had told. Reverend Amos stood on the steps of the church as the riders returned. Silas, the deputies, and a fourth man stern, sharp-bearded, and dressed in black, rode in with the clear intention of making a scene. They dismounted with the force of law in their boots and papers in their hands. Silas's mouth was set in a grim line of triumph. He was done with subtlety. This was the moment he meant to claim the girl and crush anyone who stood in his way. But the Reverend did not move aside. He stepped down from the church steps, a worn leather book in his hand, its pages yellowed and marked with the care of decades. His voice rang clear across the square, not loud but steady. "You come here with claims and contracts," he said, "but the law you carry is not the law that binds our souls. This book here," he lifted it, "was printed before the war and after it. And in it is a statute passed in the year of our Lord, 1867, stating that no person of any race or nation may be held as property under the laws of this state." Silas rolled his eyes, waving a sheet in reply. "You're not a lawyer, preacher. You're a sentimental fool clinging to scripture and dreams. That girl is stolen goods. The papers I hold are real." The crowd had begun to gather. Slowly, at first Alma from the general store, apron still dusted in flour, old Deke from the forge, hands blackened with soot. A young mother, clutching her child, stood beside a ranch hand, chewing on a stem of dry grass. They stood quietly, but their presence changed the shape of the space around Silas. It narrowed him, diminished him. "I've read your kind of papers before," Reverend Amos replied. "They were used to bind women to brothels and children to mines. But I've also seen men like Boone," he added, turning toward the crowd, "who've buried more sorrow than they dare to speak and still choose kindness when the world gives them every reason not to. That girl is no one's property. She is a survivor." Silas scoffed. "You going to stop me with a sermon?" Then Alma stepped forward, arms crossed. "He won't have to." Deke joined her. "You said she was nothing, but we've seen her. She's more decent than half the men in this town." A murmur ran through the gathering, quiet, sure, and growing. The sheriff, who had been lingering by the stable, looked on but did not move to intervene. His silence was telling. Silas turned in a slow circle, realizing just how many eyes were on him now and how few supported him. The paper in his hand felt suddenly light, impotent. He sneered at the preacher, but there was doubt in his glare. "You think you've won," he spat. "No," Amos said softly. "I think we've finally remembered who we are." Silas mounted his horse, his face tight with rage and something else, fear. He rode out of town without another word, the deputies following with uncertainty, dragging at their reins. And the people of Elk's Crossing watched him go, not as cowards hiding behind shutters, but as witnesses to a choice one that had been made in quiet hearts long before the preacher ever opened his book. The church house bell rang at noon, though it was not Sunday. Its chime echoed through Elk's Crossing like a call beyond religion, something older, something communal. By the time the hour struck its final note, nearly every able-bodied soul had filed into the narrow wooden chapel at the top of the hill, where rows of pews creaked beneath the weight of watchful eyes and uncertain hearts. Miss Ida sat near the front, hands folded neatly over her lap, her eyes alert. Elias stood near the altar, not behind the pulpit like the preacher, but to the side, where judgment fell heavier. And Mei Lin, dressed in her cleanest shawl, hair braided with care, stood between them both, small and still, the center of every gaze. It had not been called a trial, not allowed, but it was one in every way that mattered. Silas McGraw had returned at dawn, red-faced and armed with words instead of weapons. He demanded justice, demanded the enforcement of contracts, demanded the return of what he called an obligation left unpaid. He laid the blame at Elias's feet and painted Mei Lin as a deceiver, a fugitive, a danger to decency. But the preacher, standing tall behind his book of laws and gospel, had called for the town to gather, brawl the town to hear truth, not accusations. Now, as snow fell soft and slow outside the stained glass windows, Mei Lin stood at the heart of that truth. She glanced once at Miss Ida, who gave her a gentle nod, then looked at Reverend Amos, who stepped forward and said, "With your permission, she will speak." In her words, and in ours. Mei Lin's voice was faint at first. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a slip of paper, one she had practiced from the night before. Ida had translated it with care, and Mei Lin had memorized the phrases like steps in a dance. "My name is Mei Lin," she said slowly, each syllable shaped carefully. "I come from a place far. I did not choose to be sold. I did not choose the fire." She paused, glancing toward Elias. "I choose to live." Gasps murmured through the pews, not loud but undeniable. She lifted her chin. "I did not know his name," she said, "when I stepped down from the coach. But I know his heart. He did not ask for me. He did not send me back." The preacher translated when needed, gently clarifying her words, but it was Mei Lin's voice that carried. When she finished, Elias stepped forward. His hands were clenched at his sides, not in anger, but in the struggle of finding words he'd kept buried for years. From his coat, he pulled a folded paper, the same letter he had once placed beneath an oil lamp and never mailed. "I asked for a wife," he said, voice rough as bark. "Not for comfort, not for company, for penance." The room fell silent. "I lost a daughter," he continued. "My wife left not long after. I was a man made of silence and grief. I sent a letter asking for someone who would let me prove I was not beyond saving." He opened the letter, then closed it again. "They sent the wrong woman. Or maybe the right one." The room held its breath. No one moved, not even Silas, who stood in the back, his face pale, paper clenched in his fist but unread. Elias turned to Mei Lin. "I never expected to find something worth protecting again, but I did." And then he faced the crowd. "If you mean to take her, you'll have to say, before God and each other, that what she's endured means nothing." No one did. The silence stretched long and deep then. One by one, heads began to bow, not in fear, in reverence. In the church house, no gavel fell, no sentence was passed, but justice, clear and unspoken, had already found its way in. The arrival of Judge Horace Bell was not dramatic, but it was decisive. He came alone on a chestnut horse, wrapped in a black wool coat that had seen 20 winters, and carried with him 2 leather satchels, one for legal texts, the other for judgments already rendered. He was a tall man with deep-set eyes and a silver beard trimmed close, and though his back bent slightly with age, there was nothing frail about the way he dismounted in front of the church house where the meeting had been reconvened. He greeted no one with fanfare. He merely nodded once to Reverend Amos and stepped inside. The townsfolk had gathered again, this time in a hush more solemn than before. There was no shouting, no threats, only the weight of waiting. Silas stood near the front with his papers in hand, his expression a mask of composure stretched thin over nerves. Elias sat beside Mei Lin, his posture straight, one hand resting loosely on his knee. Mei Lin, dressed simply in gray, looked ahead, calm but wary. Judge Bell approached the altar, where a table had been set for review. He placed both satchels down, unfastened one, and pulled out a set of reading spectacles. He did not begin with a speech. He simply reached out a long hand. "Bring the documents." Silas stepped forward quickly, eager, and handed over a folded set of pages stamped with seals and flourishes, the supposed proof of ownership and breach of contract. The judge took them without comment, then looked to Reverend Amos. "You said there was another document." The preacher handed over a smaller envelope, Elias's original letter to the mail order agency, and the reply it had received. Judge Bell laid both sets side by side and began to read, slowly, with meticulous care. The only sound in the church was the shifting of wood as men and women leaned forward, breath held. Minutes passed. The judge flipped one page, then another, his brow furrowed, his mouth twitched once. Then he set the forged papers down and looked up. "These," he said, tapping the elaborate form Silas had provided, "are forgeries, sloppy ones, at that." A collective breath was drawn in, sharp and astonished. "This seal is from a Sacramento estate office that no longer exists. The notary mark is from a man who died 2 years ago, and the language used here, owned and bound, was outlawed in this state with the Emancipation Reform of 1870. Silas took a step back, color draining from his cheeks. Judge Bell turned to Elias. "Your correspondence is legitimate. There's no violation of contract. There is, in fact, no contract beyond the original request for companionship, which has no legal bearing on the woman's autonomy. She is free and under no obligation to any party." He turned his gaze back to Silas, colder now. "For presenting false documents with intent to deprive another of their liberty, you are fined $200 and ordered to vacate this township within 72 hours. If you remain beyond that, you will face charges." Silas opened his mouth, but the judge raised one hand. "You've had your say, Mr. McGraw. I suggest you use the rest of your breath to apologize." Silas said nothing. He turned on his heel, stalked from the room, and did not look back. Judge Bell gathered the papers, folded them neatly, and returned them to his satchel. Then he looked to Mei Lin. "You have been wronged, miss, but you are not forgotten. This community owes you its protection and respect." Mei Lin bowed her head slightly. She didn't know every word, but she knew enough. And more than words, she saw it in the room. Faces changed. Minds changed. Justice had come, not with fire or violence, but with truth and consequence. The judge tipped his hat and left the church in silence. Outside, the wind stirred again through the pines, not as warning, but as release. By the time the last frost receded from the valley floor, the mountain had softened. The snowmelt trickled down in quiet rivulets, feeding the stream that curved behind Elias Boone's cabin, like a silver thread stitching land to sky. Where the soil had once been hard-packed and brittle, it now yielded beneath fingers and spades. Wildflowers blinked open along the tree line, and birds returned with bright songs. Spring had come not suddenly, but faithfully, and with it came the slow reshaping of life. Elias stood beside the cabin, with sleeves rolled and hands dirt-streaked, guiding a wooden hoe through a freshly turned plot of earth. The garden had started small, almost as an afterthought. A few rows of carrots, maybe potatoes. But Mei Lin had added more, coaxing seeds into the ground with quiet diligence, and a whisper of something that looked like hope. She brought out her brush one morning and painted symbols on stakes to mark each row, words like strength, growth, and home, written in graceful, looping strokes. They didn't speak much while they worked. Words weren't needed. A nod, a gesture, a shared glance beneath the brim of a straw hat. Elias found comfort in the rhythm: dig, drop, pat. The smell of earth was clean and new, and the calluses on his hands no longer felt like reminders of all he'd lost, but evidence of what he was still willing to build. Mei Lin wore a blue kerchief and worked barefoot in the soft soil. When she smiled, it was quieter than the birdsong, but just as true. She had planted a row of herbs by the cabin window: mint, ginger, chamomile, and tended them with care. The sparrow that once healed by her hands now nested nearby and sang from the branches above the garden as though blessing each sprout. On the hill above town, Elias had taken to cutting lumber. Each morning after the garden, he hitched the mule and hauled logs from the far stand of pine. And slowly, beam by beam, he built the schoolhouse. It was nothing fancy: 4 walls, a single room, and a wide window to let the light in. But the townsfolk came by to help without being asked. Alma sent books. Reverend Amos offered benches from the church. Even old Deke carved a sign to hang above the door: Hope Springs Schoolhouse. When the building stood finished, freshly whitewashed and smelling of cedar, Mei Lin stepped inside with a small bundle of brushes and a pot of ink. She greeted the children one by one with a gentle smile and soft words. At first, they stared, curious and unsure. But when she dipped a brush into the ink and painted the character for Friend on a scrap of paper, they leaned forward, eager to try. She taught them to write their names in 2 languages. She taught them that kindness could sound different but still feel the same. She taught them to sit still and listen to the wind. One boy brought her a frog in his pocket. A girl gave her a ribbon. And each day, the schoolhouse grew fuller, not just with lessons, but with trust. Elias watched it all from the doorway, arms crossed, his heart no longer heavy in his chest. They had not spoken of love, not aloud. There had been no vows exchanged, no kisses stolen beneath the budding trees. But there was something between them now, steady and blooming. It lived in the furrows of the garden, in the brushstrokes of the children, in the quiet evenings when they sat side by side and drank tea in the golden light. Spring had come, and it had stayed. The sun sank low behind the ridgeline, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the kind of light that made even the oldest pine look touched by grace. The air was warm and still, carrying the scent of tilled soil and honeysuckle. In the clearing beside the schoolhouse, the people of Elk's Crossing had gathered not for a festival, not for a sermon, but simply to be together. There was no preacher at the front, no altar, no vows waiting to be spoken. Just long wooden tables draped in patched quilts, bowls of spring greens and warm bread passed hand to hand, and laughter rising like birdsong in the dusk. Elias Boone stood to one side, his sleeves rolled, a mug of cider in his rough hand. His beard was trimmed short now, his eyes clearer. Not lighter, he would always carry a quiet heaviness, but steady, open. Mei Lin was near the garden, arranging bundles of wildflowers in a hollowed stump the children had filled with stream pebbles. The youngest girl from the schoolhouse, hair in twin braids, and dress dusted with flour, clutched her hand and chattered in 2 languages at once, English and Mandarin, tangled like climbing vines. Mei Lin laughed softly, nodded, corrected the girl's brushstroke mid-air with a movement of her fingers, then gently kissed her on the crown of the head. No one called it a celebration, but everyone knew what it was. Elias hadn't asked for it, and Mei Lin hadn't expected it, and still, it came. The townsfolk had brought what they could: jars of pickled beans, tins of molasses cookies, quilts stitched with initials and old stories. Reverend Amos offered a benediction, not from the pulpit, but while standing on the grass, his voice light and easy. "We gather tonight not for ceremony," he said, "but to witness something rare: 2 souls who've walked through fire, through snow, through silence, and found each other not by law, but by choice. There's no need for rings or papers when what's been built speaks louder than any promise." Heads nodded. Some eyes glistened. Miss Ida wiped her cheeks with the hem of her apron, grumbling softly about spring air getting in her eyes. As the light dimmed, the children gathered in a circle near the old tree stump. Mei Lin took out her reed flute, the same one she had played that winter night long ago. She sat on the grass, legs folded beneath her, and lifted it to her lips. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like memory returning. Then the tune unfurled, carried gently over the heads of the gathered crowd, up into the pines where the wind waited to catch it. Elias moved to sit beside her, his back straight, his shoulder barely brushing hers. She didn't look at him, but her tune shifted ever so slightly, welcoming him in. After a moment, he began to hum along low and steady, just as he had once before. No words, no need. And as the melody rose into the evening, something settled in the space between them and the people they had come to call neighbors. Not a label, not a title, but family made not by blood nor by law, but by 1,000 small kindnesses, by shared silence and shared strength. The sky darkened to a deep indigo. The flute's final notes lingered above the treetops, fading slowly into the hush. And in that hush, beneath the wide sky, Elias and Mei Lin remained two broken people who had chosen to stay, to tend, to build, not because they had to, but because they could. And the mountain, eternal and watchful, stood quiet witness to it all.